My name is Calvin Pierce. I am 61 years old, and my life changed the night my own son looked me dead in the eye at my dining table and called me a loser. He sat there swirling a glass of expensive wine and proudly declared that his mother's new husband was the real man of the house because he actually got things done. I did not yell. I did not throw my napkin or kick them out. I simply chewed my steak and smiled. What my son did not know was that exactly 2 weeks later, he would be standing in the freezing rain without a car, without a dime to his name, and without a roof over his head. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly teach an arrogant person the hardest lesson of their life. It was a Tuesday evening, and the air in my dining room was thick with a tension you could slice with a knife. We were seated around the large mahogany dining table I had built with my own 2 bare hands 30 years ago. I remember the months I spent sanding that wood, shaping it, sealing it, imagining all the family dinners, the holiday turkeys, and the birthday cakes it would hold. The wood was worn smooth now, carrying the invisible scars and memories of a family that had long since fractured. Across from me sat my 24-year-old son, Tyler. He was practically vibrating with an arrogant, nervous energy that filled the room. Tyler had dropped out of college a few years back, claiming the academic world was too slow for a visionary like him. Since then, he had bounced from one grand illusion to the next, always chasing a shortcut to wealth, without ever wanting to put in the actual work. Flanking Tyler were his mother, Valerie, and her new husband, Lance. Valerie and I had been divorced for 5 years. The split was ugly, driven mostly by her insatiable desire for a flashy lifestyle I refused to finance with empty debt. She wanted country clubs, designer labels, and leased luxury vehicles. I wanted quiet stability and long-term security. Eventually, she found exactly what she was looking for in Lance. Lance was a slick corporate consultant. He wore custom-tailored suits that looked a little too tight and smiled a bright, blinding smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had the kind of polished, aggressive confidence that easily fools desperate people. Tonight, he was holding court at my table, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet he had brought as a gift. It was a subtle power move, bringing a $200 bottle of wine to the home of a man who drank tap water and black drip coffee. Tyler took a generous sip of the dark red liquid, mimicking Lance's sophisticated swirl. He looked across the table at me, his eyes gleaming with a strange, defiant superiority. It was the look of a young man who thought he had finally figured out how the world worked, completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor. The conversation had been grating all evening. Lance dominated the room, dropping names of executives and local politicians, boasting about his massive corporate mergers and casually mentioning his upcoming trips to Dubai and Monaco. Valerie hung onto his every word, occasionally casting pitying glances my way, as if silently asking how I could ever compete with such a magnificent specimen of a man. I focused on my plate. I had learned a long time ago that you cannot argue with people who are intoxicated by their own delusions. Then the conversation shifted to Tyler's future. For months, Tyler had been unemployed, claiming he was waiting for the right opportunity that matched his unique talents. Now he leaned forward, planting his elbows aggressively on my mahogany table. Dad Tyler began, his voice cutting through the clinking of silverware. Lance just pulled some strings. He got me an interview at one of the top marketing firms in the city. Direct access to the senior vice president. No resume screening, no waiting in line with the rest of the sheep. That is wonderful news, Tyler, I said evenly, keeping my voice low and steady. I hope you are preparing diligently for the interview. Tyler scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the dining room walls. Prepare. I do not need to prepare like some entry-level drone. Lance already sealed the deal. That is how real business works, Dad. It is about who you know and how you leverage power. Valerie chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Lance is an incredible mentor to Tyler, Calvin. He's finally giving our boy the kind of guidance and ambition he has been lacking all these years. It takes a real executive to show a young man how to succeed. I took a slow breath. The insult was thinly veiled, but I refused to take the bait. I picked up my knife and fork and began to cut a piece of my steak. Tyler, however, was not satisfied with my silence. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a fight. He wanted to assert his newfound dominance in the very house he grew up in. He leaned even closer, the smell of the expensive Cabernet heavy on his breath. His face twisted into an ugly, contemptuous sneer. "You just do not get it, do you?" Tyler said, his voice rising, shedding any pretense of respect. "You sit here in this old apartment working the same boring routine, saving pennies like a coward. You have never taken a risk in your life. You are a loser, Dad." Lance actually gets things done. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. A dead silence fell over the room. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Valerie froze her wine glass halfway to her lips. Even Lance seemed to stiffen slightly, perhaps realizing that his protege had pushed the boundary a little too far. They all waited for the explosion. They waited for me to slam my fists on the table, to shout, to demand respect, to kick them out of my home into the cold night air. I felt the familiar heat of anger rise in my chest, a primal instinct to defend my territory and my honor. But then a colder, sharper realization washed over me. Getting angry would only validate their twisted narrative. It would make me the bitter, jealous ex-husband and the out-of-touch father. Anger was cheap. Action was expensive. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I saw the arrogance, the entitlement, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He believed he was riding an unstoppable wave to the top, financed and guided by a corporate titan. He believed I was nothing but a stepping stone he had successfully leaped over. I did not yell. I did not throw my napkin. I slowly placed the perfectly square piece of steak into my mouth. I chewed methodically, tasting the rich flavors of the meat, forcing my heart rate to slow down to a steady, calm rhythm. I swallowed, took my cloth napkin, and carefully dabbed the corners of my mouth. I looked at Tyler, then at Lance, and finally at Valerie. I gave a simple, polite nod. "Well," I said, my voice as calm and smooth as a frozen lake. "I wish you the best of luck with your new venture, Tyler. I am sure Lance will guide you exactly where you are meant to go." Tyler blinked, visibly confused by my lack of outrage. He exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Lance, who offered a tight, forced smile. Valerie let out a breath she had been holding, clearly relieved in that I had chosen to be the passive, defeated man they all assumed I was. The rest of the dinner proceeded in an awkward, strained silence. The triumphant energy had drained from the room, replaced by a lingering unease. When they finally stood up to leave, Tyler did not look me in the eye. He murmured a quick goodbye and hurried out the door, eager to escape the heavy gravity of my silence. I stood in the doorway and watched them pile into Lance's gleaming luxury sedan. I watched the taillights disappear down the street, leaving me alone in the quiet of my home. I walked back to the dining room and began to clear the plates. As I wiped down the mahogany table, my hands moved with a new, terrifying purpose. For 3 years, I had been Tyler's invisible shield. I had protected him from his own failures, subsidizing his life in secret so he would never hit rock bottom. I had thought I was being a good father. I thought I was giving him time to mature. But tonight, the truth had been served on a silver platter. My protection had not saved him. It had corrupted him. It had bred a monster of entitlement who felt perfectly comfortable disrespecting the man who put food on his table. Tyler thought Lance was his savior. He thought Lance was the man who got things done. I finished cleaning the table and walked toward my bedroom. I was not angry anymore. I was focused. Tyler wanted to live in the fast lane with the corporate sharks. He wanted to rely on a slick consultant who dealt in illusions. It was time to let him have exactly what he asked for. It was time to remove the safety net and let gravity do its job. The tires of my old Ford truck hummed a steady, low rhythm against the wet pavement as I drove away from the dining restaurant. The rain fell in heavy sheets, washing down the windshield and blurring the bright neon signs of the city. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel, feeling the familiar grooves under my calloused hands. This truck was 15 years old. It rattled when the heater turned on, and it smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil. I could easily afford a fleet of luxury cars, but I preferred this truck. It was honest. It did exactly what it was built to do without any pretense. I navigated the slick streets, leaving the wealthy downtown district behind. I drove toward the edge of town where the towering glass high-rises gradually gave way to simple brick apartment complexes and quiet, modest neighborhoods. I parked in my assigned spot near the back of the lot. The rain drummed heavily against my shoulders as I walked up the 3 flights of concrete stairs to my door. I did not live in this small apartment because I had to. I lived here because it kept me grounded. It kept my life quiet, and it kept me invisible from people who measure a man's worth by the size of his house. Inside my apartment, the air was still and cool. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. I walked straight to my bedroom, guided only by the faint glow of the street lamps filtering through the simple plastic blinds. I went directly to the small, narrow closet in the corner of the room. I knelt on the faded beige carpet and ran my fingers along the wooden baseboard until I found the familiar, hidden groove. I pushed firmly against the wood, and a section of the floorboards popped free from its hidden latch. Beneath it, resting in the dark space between the floor joists, sat a heavy iron safe. The cold metal bit into my fingertips as I dialed the mechanical combination. It was a long sequence of numbers only I knew. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying deep clunk. I did not keep stacks of cash in here. Cash was foolish and temporary. I kept records. I reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound ledger. The dark brown leather was soft and worn from years of handling. I carried the ledger to the small oak desk in the corner of my room and clicked on a small brass reading lamp. I opened the heavy cover and stared at the neat, precise columns of numbers I had meticulously recorded in black ink over the last 3 years. This book contained the undeniable truth my son completely refused to see. Tyler firmly believed he had been selected for an anonymous family trust established by some distant wealthy relative who admired his potential. He told everyone that a mysterious corporate benefactor was financing his journey to greatness. He was entirely wrong. The anonymous wealthy benefactor was the very man he had just called a loser across a dinner table. My finger traced the ink down the right side of the page, documenting a massive outflow of wealth. 3 years ago, when Tyler dropped out of college claiming he needed time to find his true calling, I made a choice. I wanted to protect him from the crushing weight of sudden failure in an unforgiving economy. I set up the blind trust through a proxy financial firm using my own hidden assets. I sat back and watched the numbers tally up month after month. $4,000 every 30 days for the lease on his luxury downtown apartment with the skyline view. $800 a month for the premium insurance policy on his sleek imported car. Thousands more quietly funneled to pay off his maxed-out credit cards every time he threw an extravagant party to impress people who did not truly care about him. I subsidized every illusion of success he currently paraded around the city. I had spent a small fortune ensuring he never had to feel the sharp sting of an unpaid bill or the paralyzing panic of an eviction notice on his front door. I thought I was buying him time to grow up and find his footing. Instead, I had purchased his arrogance. I had built a padded room that prevented him from ever experiencing reality. As I stared at the sum total of my misguided paternal protection, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. The sudden loud buzz pulled me out of my deep thoughts. I took the phone out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an automated security alert from my private banking application. The specific account tied directly to the proxy funds feeding Tyler's trust had registered a new transaction. The notification glowed brightly in the dim room. A new charge had just been successfully authorized. $2,000 at an exclusive 5-star mountain resort located 3 hours north of the city. The digital memo line auto-populated from the booking agency indicated a luxury weekend getaway package reserved for 3 adult guests. Tyler was using the trust money I provided to pay for a vacation with his mother and her slick new husband. I was literally financing the very people who mocked me to my face. I was paying for Lance to drink expensive wine and act like a titan of industry while my son cheered him on and absorbed his toxic behavior. A profound and absolute calm washed over me. It was the kind of cold clarity that comes when a thick fog finally lifts and the landscape ahead becomes razor sharp. I closed the heavy leather ledger. The dull thud of the cover snapping shut sounded like a judge's gavel falling in an empty courtroom. The time for silent protection was officially over. A safety net is meant to catch someone when they stumble and fall, not suspend them indefinitely in a fantasy world of entitlement. I opened my laptop and entered my complex security credentials. The screen illuminated my face with a pale blue light cutting through the shadows of the bedroom. I navigated to the secure administrative portal for the proxy trust management firm. The banking interface was simple and cold, displaying a web of automated transfers scheduled to deploy automatically on the first of the approaching month. The luxury apartment lease payment was pending. The expensive car insurance draft was queued. The credit card clearing transfers were waiting for authorization. I moved the cursor to the master control switch at the top of the screen. I did not hesitate for a single second. I clicked the button to suspend all outgoing financial transactions. A warning dialog box appeared on the screen asking me to confirm the immediate cancellation of the automated payments. I pressed confirm. Another warning box appeared regarding the active credit accounts tied to the trust. I permanently revoked the spending authorization for all secondary users. I clicked confirm again. One by one, I systematically severed the financial arteries that kept my son's artificial life pumping. I watched the status bars turn from active green to a dead flat red. Within 60 seconds, the entire deed was done. The anonymous trust was completely frozen. The bank accounts were locked down tight. The endless flow of invisible money was completely stopped. I closed the laptop and let the room go dark again. I leaned back in my wooden chair and listened to the heavy rain hitting the bedroom window. Tyler wanted to live in the real world of cutthroat business and aggressive men who get things done. He was about to find out exactly how much the real world costs when the invisible safety net is finally gone. The afternoon sun was completely oblivious to the storm I had just unleashed. I was sitting at my small kitchen table with a fresh cup of black coffee when my laptop screen lit up with the first digital casualty of my son's arrogance. A real-time notification from the banking portal flashed across the screen. It was an attempted charge of $3,800 at an exclusive downtown menswear boutique. The status next to the red timestamp read, "Declined." I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the warmth spread through my chest. I knew exactly what was happening at that very second. Tyler would have walked into that high-end store with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was waiting to hand him a crown. I could picture the scene perfectly. He would be marching through the polished marble aisles, grabbing custom silk garments off the racks, preparing for the magical interview Lance had promised him. In his mind, he was already a senior executive. He would stride up to the checkout counter, demanding the usual royal treatment. He would smoothly pull out the heavy platinum credit card from his designer wallet and slide it across the cold stone surface, expecting the transaction to vanish into the anonymous family trust, just like it always did. But this time, there was no invisible father working in the shadows to clear his path. This time, the sleek card reader let out a sharp, angry beep. I watched the second notification hit my laptop screen. Another attempt for the exact same amount. Declined. I could easily imagine the deep, humiliating flush creeping up my son's neck. The cashier, a person trained to cater to the ultra-wealthy, would drop the obsequious customer service routine. That polite, fawning smile would slowly melt into a tight, patronizing grimace. It is the specific kind of look reserved for pretenders who try to punch above their financial weight class. Tyler would scoff loudly, masking his rising panic with manufactured outrage. He would blame the bank. He would blame a system glitch. He would desperately pull out his secondary card, the emergency backup line I had also severed the night before. A A third notification flashed on my screen. Declined. The humiliation must have been suffocating. For a young man who built his entire identity around the illusion of wealth, standing at a checkout counter with dead plastic is the ultimate nightmare. I knew his pride would not let him simply walk away. He would snatch the velvet garment bags from the counter, snapping at the clerk that he was stepping outside to call his wealth manager to clear the security hold. He would push through the heavy glass doors, clutching the unpaid suits like a shield, stepping out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, with his mind racing for an explanation. I did not have to imagine what would happen next, because the physical evidence was sitting right in front of me. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and took out a cheap black prepaid cell phone. This was the direct line to the Phantom Trust administrator. For 3 years, this phone had only received polite emails and occasional voicemails from Tyler, requesting budget increases or lease extensions. I placed the small plastic device next to my coffee mug. Exactly 4 minutes after the final decline transaction, the screen lit up. The phone began to vibrate violently against the wood. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I sat perfectly still and watched the device dance across the table. I listened to the harsh buzzing sound, echoing in the quiet apartment. My son was standing on a busy sidewalk miles away, desperately calling the invisible safety net he had taken for granted his entire adult life. He expected a polite corporate voice to answer, apologize for the inconvenience, and immediately unlock his funds. He expected the world to bend to his will, because Lance had convinced him that winners do not face consequences. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. Then he called again immediately. The panic was setting in. The arrogant young man from the dinner table was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a terrified kid who suddenly realized he was standing on thin air. I picked up the cheap plastic phone, popped the back cover off, and completely removed the battery. The screen went permanently black. The line was completely dead. From this moment forward, Tyler would hear nothing but a disconnected tone. The financial cutoff was only the first phase of the reality check. The second phase had already been set in motion at dawn. I opened a different tab on my laptop, bringing up the global positioning tracking software linked to the luxury vehicle I had been leasing for him. The blue dot representing his sleek imported car was parked along a busy commercial avenue directly outside the boutique he had just fled. A second dot, representing a commercial towing company I had contacted earlier, was currently merging onto the same street. Tyler would be stomping down the pavement, furious and humiliated, clutching his dead cell phone in one hand and the heavy garment bags in the other. He would be heading straight for his car, seeking the familiar comfort of the leather seats and the quiet isolation of the expensive cabin. The car was his ultimate status symbol, his rolling proof that he was better than the man who raised him. But as he approached his parking spot, he would encounter a scene that no amount of smooth talking from his new stepfather could fix. A massive heavy-duty tow truck was already backing up, aggressively blocking the street. A burly repossession agent in a stained work jacket was securing the heavy steel lifts beneath the front tires of my son's prized vehicle. I watched the two digital dots on my screen overlap. Tyler would run forward, shouting and waving his arms, demanding the worker step away from his property. He would threaten lawsuits. He would drop corporate names. He would try to use every ounce of fake authority he possessed to stop the inevitable. The repo man would not care. People who do hard, honest work for a living possess a natural immunity to arrogant bluffing. The worker would simply pull a clipboard from his jacket and slap a bright yellow repossession order directly onto the windshield. The lease had not been paid. The grace period had been officially revoked by the legal owner of the contract. The owner was me, Aunt. The tow truck engine would roar to life, lifting the front of the luxury car off the pavement with a brutal mechanical groan. Tyler would be forced to stand on the curb, completely powerless, as the last major piece of his fabricated identity was dragged away down the street. He would be left stranded on the sidewalk, surrounded by busy pedestrians who did not care about his upcoming interview or his rich stepfather. The bank accounts were frozen. The phantom trust was dead. The car was gone. He was standing outside a high-end store holding 3 expensive, unpaid suits he could no longer afford to walk away with. The grand illusion was completely shattered, leaving only the cold, hard pavement beneath his feet. I closed my laptop, feeling no joy or triumph. I only felt the heavy, necessary burden of a father finally allowing gravity to do its job. I received the automated email from the downtown property management group precisely at 2:00 in the afternoon. The message was a simple administrative confirmation stating that the lease termination documents had been hand-delivered to the concierge desk of my son's building. I closed the email and leaned back in my wooden chair. Tyler was currently making the longest and most humiliating commute of his entire life. Without a vehicle, and with his credit cards completely frozen, he would have been forced to rely on whatever meager balance remained in his rideshare application. He would be sitting in the back of a standard economy sedan, watching the rain streak the windows, completely stripped of the imported luxury he believed was his birthright. He was heading back to his expensive high-rise sanctuary, seeking a place to hide and regroup. He fully expected to walk into his sprawling apartment, pour himself a glass of expensive bottled water, and dial his stepfather to fix the temporary inconvenience of a declined card. He had no idea the sanctuary no longer existed. The glass tower where Tyler lived was a monument to modern excess. It boasted a marble lobby, a private fitness center, and a rooftop infinity pool. I knew the building well because I had written the massive deposit check that secured his top-floor corner unit. I had paid the exorbitant monthly maintenance fees that allowed him to walk past the front desk with his head held high. I could perfectly envision him arriving at the grand entrance. He would step out of the cheap ride-share car, quickly keeping his head down to avoid being seen by his wealthy neighbors. He would march up the wide stone steps, shaking the rain from his coat, desperate to get inside. He would reach the heavy glass security doors and pull his leather keychain from his pocket. For 3 years, that small, black electronic fob had been his magic wand. A simple tap against the glowing security panel always granted him immediate access to a world of privilege. He would press the plastic chip against the glass, expecting the familiar soft chime and the click of the unlocking mechanism. Instead, the security panel would emit a harsh, low buzz. A solid red light would flash across the screen. He would frown, wiping the rain from his eyes, assuming the sensor was merely wet. He would press the fob against the glass a second time, pushing harder. The same angry red light would glare back at him. The magic wand was completely dead. Tyler would be forced to use the manual intercom button, a feature reserved for delivery drivers and uninvited guests. The heavy glass doors would eventually slide open, not because of his status, but because the concierge allowed him entry. Tyler would storm into the expansive lobby, dripping rainwater onto the pristine imported rugs. He would march directly toward the front desk, furious and ready to unleash his manufactured authority on the building staff. The man working the desk was a seasoned professional named Vincent. For 3 years, Tyler had walked past Vincent without offering a single greeting or a nod of acknowledgement. Tyler treated the working class like invisible furniture. Now he was entirely at the mercy of the man he had repeatedly ignored. Tyler would demand a replacement key, raising his voice to echo off the vaulted ceiling. He would threaten to have Vincent fired for the malfunction. Vincent would not flinch or apologize. A man who earns his living dealing with the entitled elite possesses an impenetrable armor of professional indifference. Vincent would simply reach beneath the polished granite counter and retrieve a thick manila envelope. He would slide the heavy paper package across the smooth stone surface, tapping it once with his index finger. He would calmly inform Tyler that the security fob had not malfunctioned. The building management had permanently deactivated his access. Tyler would rip open the envelope right there in the lobby, his fingers tearing the thick paper in his haste. He would pull out the crisp legal documents. The heavy black text at the top of the page declared a notice of immediate lease termination and eviction. His eyes would dart across the paragraphs trying to make sense of the dense legal terminology. The document explicitly stated that the anonymous financial trust backing the rental agreement had been fully dissolved by the primary benefactor. Without the financial guarantee, the lease was immediately void. The management company required him to vacate the premises within 24 hours. Furthermore, he was barred from entering the residential floors without a security escort to retrieve his personal belongings. The cold reality of the printed words would hit Tyler like a physical blow. The safety net was not just torn, it was entirely incinerated. He was standing in a brightly lit lobby holding a piece of paper that legally declared him a trespasser in his own home. The panic would rise in his chest, tight and suffocating. The arrogant young man who had mocked me at the dinner table was now a terrified child locked out in the cold. He needed an immediate bailout. He needed someone with power and deep pockets to make the bad news disappear. He would pull his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He would not call me. I was the loser living in a modest apartment. He would call the woman who had traded her family for a corporate illusion. He would call his mother, Valerie. I knew exactly how that phone call would play out, because I knew my ex-wife better than she knew herself. Valerie would be at her exclusive day spa lounging in a plush white robe with cucumbers over her eyes. She would be surrounded by the soothing sounds of cascading water and ambient flute music. When her phone began to vibrate, she would answer with a tone of profound annoyance, frustrated that her afternoon of pampered relaxation was being interrupted. Tyler would not bother with a greeting. He would launch into a frantic, chaotic explanation of the last 2 hours. He would tell her about the declined credit cards at the boutique. He would describe the humiliating repossession of his luxury vehicle on the city street. He would read the eviction notice aloud, his voice cracking as he begged for help. Tyler would ask to move into the sprawling suburban estate Valerie shared with Lance. He would promise it was only temporary, just a few weeks until he could secure the amazing marketing job Lance had arranged for him. He would plead for a sliver of the luxurious life they paraded in front of the world. Valerie would hesitate. The soothing spa music in the background would suddenly feel incredibly cold. Tyler would hear a muffled shuffling sound as Valerie covered the receiver of her phone with her manicured hand. She would turn to speak to her new husband, who was undoubtedly sitting in the adjacent lounge chair, enjoying his own expensive spa treatment. Valerie possessed many skills, but creating a soundproof seal over a cell phone microphone was not one of them. Tyler would hear the muffled but unmistakable voice of his stepfather bleeding through the digital connection. Lance would not be using his smooth, charming dinner party voice. He would be using his harsh, authentic corporate tone. Lance would explicitly and forcefully refuse the request. Tyler would hear the man he idolized call him a massive financial liability. He would hear Lance state that he had zero intentions of babysitting a grown man who could not manage to keep a simple apartment. The brilliant corporate titan who allegedly got things done was entirely unwilling to do a single thing for his stepson. Valerie would return to the line. The panic in her son's voice would be completely ignored. She would adopt a hollow, falsely sympathetic tone. She would tell Tyler that the timing was simply terrible. She would invent a flimsy, transparent excuse about massive plumbing renovations and contractor delays making the guest house completely uninhabitable. She would suggest he check into a hotel using his own money, completely ignoring the fact that he just told her his accounts were frozen. She would offer meaningless platitudes about staying strong and figuring things out. Then before Tyler could beg a second time, she would end the call. The line would go dead. Tyler would lower the phone, staring at the dark screen. He would stand completely alone in the massive marble lobby of a building he no longer had the right to enter. The magnificent golden illusion of his powerful, wealthy new family had shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. He was finally awake in the real world, and the real world was incredibly unforgiving. The storm that had been threatening the city all afternoon finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the streets into running rivers. The freezing rain fell in heavy punishing sheets, showing no mercy to anyone caught outside. Through the thick curtain of water, a lone figure trudged up the cracked concrete steps of my modest apartment complex. It was Tyler. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant young man who had sat at my mahogany dining table just 2 weeks prior. The swagger was entirely gone. His expensive designer haircut was plastered flat against his forehead, dripping cold water into his eyes. His custom Italian leather shoes, the ones he had bragged about buying with his first phantom bonus, were sinking into the muddy puddles pooling on the walkway. He was shivering violently, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind, holding a single overstuffed canvas duffel bag. It was the frantic, unorganized luggage of a man who had been given only minutes by building security to grab whatever he could carry before being escorted off the premises forever. He reached the small covered landing outside my front door and dropped the heavy bag onto the wet welcome mat. He did not ring the doorbell. He balled his freezing hands into fists and began pounding desperately against the solid wood. The frantic thudding echoed loudly over the roar of the rain. He started shouting my name, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and lingering entitlement. He yelled for his dad, demanding to be let in out of the cold, expecting the heavy door to swing wide open and offer him immediate, unearned sanctuary. He fully believed that no matter how horribly he treated me, my paternal obligation would automatically override my dignity. He thought I was still the invisible safety net waiting patiently to catch him. I had been sitting in my worn armchair listening to the rain beat against the glass when the pounding began. I did not rush. I took my time. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my old faded flannel sweater. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh mug of steaming black coffee, and walked slowly toward the entryway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just wide enough to stand in the frame. I did not step back. I did not gesture for him to enter. I simply stood there, a warm, immovable barrier between my son and the freezing storm outside. The contrast between us was stark. I was dry, comfortable, and completely at peace, holding a hot mug of coffee that sent thin wisps of steam into the chilly evening air. Tyler was a miserable, soaking wet monument to his own spectacular failure. His teeth were literally chattering. For a brief second, a flash of relief washed over his pale face. He assumed the hard part was over. He automatically stepped forward, attempting to push past me into the warmth of the apartment entryway. I shifted my weight, planting my shoulder firmly against the doorframe, physically blocking his path. He stopped blinking in confusion. The relief in his eyes was instantly replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. Before I could say a single word, Tyler launched into a chaotic, breathless explanation. He spoke a mile a minute, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to spin a masterpiece of deception. He claimed he was the victim of a massive, sophisticated identity theft operation. He spun a wild tale about malicious hackers infiltrating his bank accounts, freezing his assets, and triggering a cascade of catastrophic administrative errors. He insisted his landlord had made a terrible clerical mistake, locking him out of his luxury apartment over a simple banking glitch. He painted himself as the innocent victim of a broken system, completely denying any personal responsibility for the disaster that had befallen him. He demanded that I let him crash on the couch for just a few nights, while his high-powered attorneys and wealth managers sorted out the terrible misunderstanding. He spoke with the desperate, demanding tone of a child who still believed loud lies could rewrite harsh realities. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk until he completely ran out of breath. I watched the water drip from his nose and chin. When silence finally fell between us, save for the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the pavement, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I let the bitter, dark liquid wash over my tongue. I lowered the mug and looked him directly in the eyes. My gaze was completely devoid of anger, pity, or sympathy. "I am very sorry to hear about your terrible administrative troubles, Tyler," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "But I have to ask you a very simple question. Why exactly are you standing on my porch in the freezing rain? Why are you not staying over at Lance and Brenda's sprawling estate? I distinctly recall you telling me that Lance is a corporate titan who actually gets things done. Surely a man of his immense power and influence could fix a simple banking error and offer you a warm guest bedroom. The question hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The arrogant facade he had desperately tried to maintain instantly crumbled into dust. All the air seemed to rush out of his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stammered, tripping over half-formed syllables, trying desperately to invent a plausible excuse for why his wealthy mother and successful stepfather had left him stranded in a storm. He looked down at his ruined leather shoes, the shame finally breaking through his impenetrable ego. He knew that I knew. He realized in that agonizing moment that his mother had rejected him, that Lance despised him, and that the grand illusion of his new powerful family was a total fraud. He was completely alone. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice finally breaking, shedding the lies and the entitlement. "I have nowhere else to go. I just need a place to sleep tonight. Please." I looked at my son, feeling the heavy necessary burden of my decision. Giving in now, offering him the couch and a warm meal, would only teach him that his actions truly have no permanent consequences. It would teach him that he could mock, betray, and insult the people who care about him, and still retreat to their protection when the world treated him harshly. He needed to feel the absolute bottom before he could ever learn how to climb back up. "I am afraid that is not possible." "Tyler," I said, my voice remaining remarkably steady. "The lease agreement for this modest apartment is very strict. The management does not allow long-term guests or unregistered occupants to crash on the furniture. I simply cannot risk my own housing security to accommodate your sudden emergency." I reached into the front pocket of my faded flannel sweater. I pulled out a crisp $20 bill and a small, neatly folded piece of paper. I extended my hand and offered them to my son. He slowly reached out with trembling, wet fingers and took the items. He looked down at his hand. The paper was a printed list of local homeless shelters, charitable food kitchens, and public transit bus routes. It was the ultimate humbling reality check. "Use the cash to buy the hot meal and a bus ticket," I instructed him quietly. "The shelter on 4th Street does intake until 9:00. If you hurry, you can secure a warm bed for the night." "You are a smart young man, Tyler. I am completely confident you will figure out how to navigate this situation." He stared at the money, and the list tears of profound shock and humiliation mingling with the rain on his cheeks. He looked back up at me, his eyes pleading for a last-minute reprieve, begging for the invisible safety net to miraculously reappear. I did not blink. I did not soften my posture. I gave him a single polite nod of farewell. I slowly pushed the heavy wooden door closed, watching his face disappear into the narrow sliver of the doorway. The latch clicked shut, sealing away the cold night air. I reached up and smoothly slid the heavy metal deadbolt into place. The loud metallic thud echoed with absolute finality. The transaction was complete. The cord was cut. He was finally entirely on his own. The diner smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee, a sharp contrast to the polished mahogany and expensive wine from 2 weeks ago. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back facing the entrance. The morning was gray and overcast, matching the cold, clinical task I was about to initiate. I took a slow sip from my thick ceramic mug and watched the door. Exactly at 8:00, a man walked in. His name was Victor. He did not wear a tailored suit or an expensive watch. He wore a faded trench coat and carried a scuffed leather briefcase. Victor was a private investigator, a man who made his living digging through the dirty laundry of people who pretended to be clean. He slid into the booth across from me without a single word of greeting. His eyes were sharp and tired, assessing the room in a sweeping glance before settling on me. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the sticky laminate table. Victor placed his heavy hand over it. Inside the envelope were a few glossy business cards belonging to my ex-wife's new husband. There were also copies of some public financial filings I had managed to pull, and a list of the corporate entities Lance claimed to manage. I told Victor I needed to know exactly who this man was. I wanted him to excavate the glorious corporate consulting firm Lance paraded around the city. I wanted to see the actual foundations of his supposed empire because my gut told me it was built entirely on sand. Victor did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply nodded his understanding, tucked the thick envelope into his battered briefcase, and walked out into the cold, gray morning. 4 days passed. I went about my quiet routine, maintaining the absolute silence I had promised myself. I did not check on Tyler. I knew the brutal isolation was doing its necessary work. I simply waited for the inevitable return of my investigator. I spent my evenings in my small workshop, sanding down pieces of reclaimed wood, letting the repetitive physical labor keep my mind incredibly sharp. On the 5th morning, my phone vibrated with a short text message telling me to return to the diner. When I arrived, Victor was already sitting in the exact same back booth drinking black coffee. This time he did not look tired. He looked profoundly grim. He reached into his scuffed briefcase and pulled out a massive bound dossier, dropping it onto the table with a heavy thud. He slid it toward me, his face completely devoid of emotion. He told me I was absolutely right to be suspicious. He told me the man claiming to be a titan of industry was nothing more than a highly sophisticated parasite feeding on the desperate ambitions of gullible people. I opened the heavy dossier and began to read the meticulously organized reports. The glossy corporate consulting firm was a complete fabrication. It was a hollow shell company registered to a vacant post office box in a distant state. Lance was not a wealthy executive closing massive international mergers. He was a professional con artist running an elaborate and incredibly desperate Ponzi scheme. For the past 2 years, he had been quietly bleeding Brenda's savings dry to maintain the extravagant illusion of his wealth. The expensive wine, the luxury cars, the sprawling suburban estate, they were all financed by my ex-wife's rapidly depleting retirement accounts and a staggering mountain of toxic debt. Lance was a predator who had found the perfect willing victim in a woman totally obsessed with status and superficial appearances. But as I turned the crisp white pages, the reality grew much darker than simple marital fraud. I reached a section highlighted with bright red tabs. I read the documented bank trails and felt a cold fury settle deep in my bones. The prestigious marketing interview Lance had supposedly arranged for my son was a complete lie. It was nothing more than a calculated ruse to obtain Tyler's personal information. Tyler, blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate desire to join the elite, had willingly handed over his social security number, his banking details, and his signature under the guise of an executive background check. He had practically gift-wrapped his identity for a financial predator. The dossier revealed that Lance had weaponized that information instantly. He had used my son's stolen identity to secure massive fraudulent business loans from several unsecured online creditors. The thousands of dollars were immediately funneled into offshore accounts to keep his collapsing Ponzi scheme afloat just a little longer. Tyler was not just stranded and broke. Because of his blind trust in a smooth-talking con man, he was now unknowingly buried under 6 figures of federal financial fraud. He was sitting in a local homeless shelter eating charity meals, completely unaware that his beloved stepfather had legally tied him to an anchor and thrown him overboard into a freezing ocean of debt. I closed the folder and looked across the table at Victor. My face remained perfectly calm, but my mind was operating with surgical precision. I asked Victor what Lance's immediate next move was. The investigator pulled out a final sheet of paper showing a timeline of recent asset transfers. He explained that Lance was currently preparing to leverage Brenda's final remaining assets. The Ponzi scheme was finally collapsing inward, and the fake executive was preparing his exit strategy. He was quietly liquidating her remaining mutual funds and attempting to secure a massive second mortgage on the suburban estate. Lance was planning to cut his losses, take the last of the available cash, and flee the country before the fraudulent loans defaulted and the federal authorities came knocking at his door. Victor asked me if I wanted him to contact the police immediately. He warned me that if we waited even a few days, Lance might successfully disappear, and Tyler would be left holding the bag for the massive federal fraud. My son would be arrested and prosecuted for crimes he was too foolish to realize he was committing. I looked down at the heavy dossier resting on the sticky diner table. Calling the authorities right now would be the easy way out. It would alert Lance and cause a chaotic, messy panic, giving him a chance to slip away in the confusion. A predator like Lance needed to be trapped completely unaware in a room with absolutely no exits. I told Victor to compile every single piece of evidence into a secure digital file. I instructed him to prepare all the necessary documentation for the Financial Crimes Division and the local authorities, but to strictly hold off on making the official call. I did not want Lance to get a panicked phone call from a bank teller or a warning knock from a suspicious detective. I wanted him to walk willingly into his own destruction, believing he was about to secure his final massive payday. I thanked Victor for his excellent, thorough work and paid him his substantial fee in cash. I picked up the heavy dossier and walked out of the diner. The sky was finally beginning to clear, casting bright rays of sunlight across the wet pavement. The foundation of lies was fully exposed. It was time to make a very difficult phone call to my ex-wife and set the stage for the ultimate reckoning. My cellular phone rang early the next morning, breaking the profound silence of my apartment. The caller identification displayed the name of my former wife. Brenda rarely called me directly unless she required a convenient scapegoat for a problem she could not solve with her checkbook. I answered the call and was immediately met with a shrill, frantic barrage of accusations. Her voice echoed sharply through the small speaker, entirely devoid of her usual polished country club composure. She demanded to know what kind of monster abandons his own flesh and blood to wander the streets in the freezing rain. She screamed that Tyler was currently sleeping on a narrow cot in a dirty downtown charity shelter because I was too bitter and cheap to open my door. I let her vent her manufactured outrage. I listened to her breathing hitch as she tried to maintain the moral high ground, relying on the aggressive tactics she always used to win our past arguments. I did not raise my voice or defend my actions. I simply told her that if she truly wanted to save our son from permanent ruin, she needed to meet me in exactly 1 hour. I chose a sterile corporate coffee shop located precisely halfway between my modest neighborhood and her sprawling suburban estate. It was a place where neither of us held any social advantage. I ended the call before she could argue the terms or demand further explanations. The coffee shop was a stark, brightly lit room filled with cheap laminate tables and the overpowering smell of burnt espresso beans. It was the perfect neutral territory, offering absolutely no comfort or warmth. I arrived 15 minutes early, securing a small table in the far corner, facing the large plate glass windows. I drank a cup of plain hot water and watched the busy street outside. Brenda walked through the double sliding doors precisely on time, but she looked nothing like the flawlessly manicured woman who had mocked me at the dining table just a short time ago. The cracks in her magnificent illusion were finally beginning to show for the entire world to see. She wore an expensive designer trench coat, but it was hastily thrown over a wrinkled silk blouse. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was pulled back into a severe tight knot, and the heavy, expensive makeup around her eyes could not completely hide the deep, dark circles of chronic exhaustion. The immense stress of maintaining a fraudulent lifestyle was actively eating her alive from the inside out. She marched across the shiny linoleum floor, her heels clicking with a desperate, angry energy that drew the attention of the other patrons. She dropped her heavy leather purse onto the center of the table and slid into the rigid metal chair across from me, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. She did not bother with a polite greeting or any basic pleasantries. She leaned forward and immediately launched into a vicious tirade, painting me as a deadbeat father who was intentionally punishing his son out of petty jealousy. She claimed Tyler was completely traumatized by his sudden eviction and that Lance was currently working around the clock, utilizing his vast network of powerful executive contacts to fix the massive banking error that had temporarily displaced the boy. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the toxic words without a single flinch or change in my expression. Her desperate defense of her new husband was incredibly revealing to me. She was clinging blindly to the fantasy of his immense wealth because confronting the creeping reality of her situation was simply too terrifying for her to handle. I let her exhaust her supply of insults. When she finally paused to take a ragged, shallow breath, I reached inside my thick winter jacket. I pulled out the heavy, comprehensive dossier Victor had compiled and placed it squarely in the center of the small table. I slid the thick stack of bound paper toward her until it touched her tightly clenched hands. I told her in a low, steady, unwavering voice that the man she was currently defending was actively preparing to destroy her entirely. I instructed her to open the folder and read the documents I had highlighted with bright red markers. Brenda glared at me suspiciously, but her trembling fingers reached for the heavy cover. She flipped the thick cardstock open and stared at the very first page. It was a comprehensive, detailed audit of her own personal retirement accounts, the money she had spent 30 years accumulating. I watched the remaining color completely drain from her face, transforming her complexion into a sickly, pale gray. Her eyes darted back and forth across the neat columns of printed numbers, tracking the massive, unauthorized withdrawals and the total devastating liquidation of her life savings. She flipped to the next section, revealing the complex web of anonymous shell companies and offshore banking transfers Lance used to quietly siphon her wealth to support his collapsing investment scheme. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, mimicking the early stages of a severe panic attack. She turned another page, discovering the stack of forged loan applications bearing the stolen identity of our son and his forged signatures. I watched her perfectly constructed suburban world shatter right there in the middle of the sterile coffee shop. The arrogant defiance completely melted away, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a woman who had just realized she was sleeping next to a predator. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand, stifling a loud sob of pure, absolute horror. I did not offer her a tissue or a single comforting word to ease her profound shock. I leaned across the small table and delivered the final, devastating blow required to secure her total compliance. I explained exactly what those forged financial documents meant for our son. Lance had used the fake prestigious marketing interview to harvest the Social Security number belonging to Tyler and secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent federal business loans. Tyler was not just broke and homeless, sleeping in a charity shelter. He was currently standing on the precipice of a massive federal indictment that would lock him in a prison cell for decades. I told Brenda that Lance was currently leveraging the final remaining equity in her suburban estate to fund his immediate escape from the country. He was actively planning to vanish into the wind, leaving her completely bankrupt, facing the angry creditors alone and abandoning Tyler to take the absolute fall for the massive wire fraud. Brenda stared blindly at the damning paperwork, tears finally spilling over her lashes and dropping heavily onto the printed proof of the ultimate betrayal by her husband. She was utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the deception staring back at her. She had traded the quiet, dependable stability of our marriage for a flashy, empty corporate illusion, and it had cost her absolutely everything she valued in this world. I sat back in my rigid metal chair and offered her a very simple binary choice. She could stand up, leave the coffee shop right now, walk back to her empty, heavily mortgaged mansion, and go down with the sinking ship while our son was dragged into a federal courtroom in handcuffs. Or she could cooperate fully with me, follow my exact strict instructions, and help me trap the parasite she married before he could board an international flight. I told her I already had a brilliant private investigator and the local financial crimes authorities standing by, awaiting my direct signal to spring the trap. I simply needed the inside access only she could provide to set the final bait. Brenda looked up from the ruined financial ledgers. Her eyes were red and swollen, but a new desperate clarity shone brightly within them. She realized she had absolutely nothing left to protect and everything to lose. She wiped her wet face with the back of her trembling hand, took a slow, shaky breath, and nodded her head. She agreed to my terms completely and without hesitation. The trap was officially primed and ready to snap shut. Brenda drove her luxury vehicle back to the sprawling suburban estate she had financed with a lifetime of careful savings. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open, revealing the manicured lawns and the massive stone facade of a home she now knew was heavily mortgaged to an invisible corporate entity. She parked in the circular driveway, gripping the leather steering wheel until her knuckles turned bright white. She took 3 deep, measured breaths, forcing the absolute terror and boiling rage deep down into the pit of her stomach. She could not afford a single mistake tonight. She applied a fresh layer of expensive lipstick, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and walked through the grand mahogany front doors with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades maintaining flawless appearances. The house felt entirely different now. It felt like an active crime scene where she was the primary victim. Lance was sitting in his plush leather armchair in the vaulted living room, swirling a glass of amber liquor. He was typing aggressively on his sleek silver laptop, likely moving stolen funds across invisible digital borders to secure his impending escape. He did not look up when she entered, simply muttering a complaint about the poor wireless internet connection. Brenda walked directly over to the ornate crystal decanter, poured herself a generous measure of spirits, and forced a bright, enthusiastic smile onto her face. She sat on the edge of the matching leather sofa and told him she had spent the entire afternoon thinking about their financial future together. She praised his incredible business acumen, stroking his massive, fragile ego with calculated precision. Then he dropped the magnificent bait. She announced she had decided to completely liquidate her 3 remaining high-yield mutual funds to heavily invest in his newest international startup venture. The aggressive typing stopped instantly. Lance lowered the silver screen and looked at her with a sudden predatory intensity. A greedy, hungry light ignited in his cold eyes, completely masking his desperate need for that exact cash infusion. He quickly covered his relief with a smooth, patronizing smile, telling her it was the smartest financial decision she would ever make in her life. He smoothly suggested she just transfer the funds online using her digital banking portal tonight, to save them the hassle of a commute. Brenda held her ground, maintaining the pleasant, oblivious facade I had instructed her to wear. She insisted the account required physical dual signatures for a total liquidation due to a strict security clause she had implemented years ago. She told him they needed to visit the main downtown bank branch together first thing tomorrow morning to finalize the massive wire transfer. Lance hesitated for a fraction of a second, his innate paranoia warring with his overwhelming greed. The promise of hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable cash was simply too powerful to resist. He agreed to the morning meeting, sealing his own fate. Miles away in my quiet apartment, I sat at my wooden desk and dialed a private, unlisted number. The call bypassed the automated directory and rang directly through to the personal desk of Arthur Sterling, the senior regional director of the largest financial institution in the city. Arthur and I had a long, complex history. 30 years ago, I had quietly provided the seed capital that saved his struggling independent community bank from absolute ruin. In return, he had personally structured the impenetrable blind trust that held my quiet fortune, safely shielding my assets from public scrutiny and greedy relatives. He answered the phone with the warm, familiar tone of an old, trusted friend. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed absolute exclusive access to his secure private conference room at 9:00 the following morning. I specified that the conference room needed to be the one located at the very back of the executive suite, away from the main teller floor, to prevent any civilian casualties if the suspect attempted to fight his way out. Arthur understood the gravity of my request immediately. He requested that his security cameras be fully operational and that the heavy soundproof doors remain locked from the outside once my specific guests arrived. He simply confirmed the arrangements and promised to handle the reception personally. While I secured the physical location, Victor was busy constructing the inescapable legal cage. He walked through the glass doors of the local financial crimes division, carrying the heavy-bound dossier we had compiled. Victor had spent 20 years as a federal fraud investigator before moving into the private sector, giving him direct access to the specific men and women who possessed the power to freeze international assets and issue immediate federal arrest warrants. He sat down with a lead detective he had trained decades prior and laid out the undeniable paper trail. He showed them the forged loan applications bearing the stolen identity of my son. He traced the digital breadcrumbs linking Lance's hollow shell companies to the fraudulent offshore accounts. The detective reviewed the network logs showing Lance accessing the fraudulent loan portals from the very same wireless router at Brenda's suburban estate. The case was airtight, leaving no room for a slick defense attorney to claim a simple misunderstanding. The evidence was pristine, unquestionable, and highly actionable. Victor explained that the suspect would be sitting in a private room at the downtown bank tomorrow morning, attempting to execute one final massive illegal wire transfer before fleeing the jurisdiction. The tactical unit commander agreed to stage plainclothes officers inside the bank lobby, posing as regular customers, while the primary arrest team waited in unmarked vehicles in the underground parking garage. The detective immediately mobilized his specialized unit, recognizing a perfectly wrapped conviction when it was handed to him. The sun slowly set over the city, casting long, dark shadows across the wet pavement. I stood by the window of my small bedroom watching the streetlights flicker to life. The immense, complex machinery of the sting operation was now fully activated, running on pure, silent momentum. Everyone was moving into their exact designated positions on the board. Brenda was sitting in her massive house, sleeping next to a predator, pretending everything was perfectly fine. Tyler was spending his first terrifying night in a loud, crowded charity shelter, completely unaware that the man who stole his future was about to face a brutal reckoning. Victor was confirming the tactical entry protocols with the armed federal agents, ensuring every possible exit route was completely sealed. Lance was undoubtedly dreaming of his impending tropical escape, believing he had successfully conned his way to a magnificent fortune. I moved away from this window and selected a fresh set of clothes for the morning. I chose a crisp white shirt, a conservative dark tie, and a simple gray suit. It was not the attire of a defeated man. It was the armor of a father stepping into a battlefield to reclaim his son's stolen future and punish a thief who preyed on the weak. I set my alarm clock for 5 a.m, wanting to be awake before the rest of the city stirred. I needed my mind to remain perfectly clear, devoid of any distracting emotion or hesitation. The plan required absolute cold precision. If Lance sensed even a single drop of fear or uncertainty, he would bolt like a startled animal. I poured myself a final glass of water, drank it slowly, and lay down on my modest bed. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant hum of highway traffic. I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact sequence of events that would unfold in the bank lobby. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the hunters were waiting patiently in the shadows. All that remained was for the arrogant thief to walk blindly into the light. The morning sun reflected harshly off the towering glass facade of the downtown financial center, casting long, sharp shadows across the wet pavement. Lance strode through the polished revolving doors with the sweeping, arrogant stride of a conquering king, returning to claim his final spoils. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit that projected absolute authority and a silk tie that screamed unearned wealth. He practically floated across the pristine marble floor of the main lobby, completely oblivious to the carefully orchestrated reality closing in tightly around him. He did not notice the 2 men in casual jackets reading newspapers near the teller line, who were actually armed federal agents waiting for a signal. He did not notice the subtle nod exchanged between the security guard and a woman pretending to fill out deposit slips at a nearby counter. Lance only saw the magnificent gleaming vault of untraceable money he believed was waiting for him. Brenda trailed half a step behind him, clutching her heavy leather purse so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She kept her eyes fixed on the back of his expensive suit, forcing her breathing to remain slow and steady. She played the part of the compliant, wealthy wife, perfectly hiding her absolute terror behind a mask of bored suburban elegance. Arthur Sterling emerged from the frosted glass doors of the executive suite, wearing a perfectly pressed charcoal suit. The senior regional director greeted Lance with a warm, professional handshake that betrayed absolutely none of the impending devastation. Lance puffed out his chest, introducing himself with his fake corporate titles and aggressively steering the conversation toward the immediate liquidation of the mutual funds. Arthur nodded smoothly, expressing no surprise at the massive financial request. He gestured politely toward the private corridor, guiding them away from the busy public floor. They walked down a long, quiet hallway, lined with original oil paintings and thick carpet that absorbed the sound of their footsteps. Arthur ushered them into the final conference room at the very end of the hall. It was a windowless fortress of a room featuring a massive mahogany table and heavy soundproof walls designed to keep million-dollar secrets entirely secure. Today, those walls would serve a much darker purpose. Lance took the seat at the head of the table, adjusting his cuffs with greedy anticipation. Arthur placed a thick stack of impressive-looking financial transfer documents directly in front of him, along with a heavy gold pen. Lance did not bother to read the fine print. His eyes were completely fixed on the final signature line where the massive transfer of wealth would become permanent. He picked up the pen, clicking it open, with a sharp, satisfying metallic snap. Before the gold nib could even touch the crisp white paper, the heavy oak door of the conference room swung open. The sudden, violent movement shattered the quiet atmosphere of the executive suite. I walked into the room first, moving with a slow, deliberate calm that instantly sucked the air out of the small space. I did not look angry. I looked like a man arriving to collect a long overdue debt. Victor stepped through the doorway immediately behind me, his broad shoulders completely filling the frame. Two uniformed police officers marched in last, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet with absolute, terrifying authority. They moved with silent military precision, fanning out along the back wall and blocking any possible path of retreat. Arthur silently stepped backward, melting into the shadows of the room. The heavy soundproof door clicked shut, sealing us all inside the inescapable vault. Lance froze with the gold pen suspended entirely in midair. A look of profound confusion washed over his polished features, quickly followed by a desperate, defensive arrogance. He dropped the pen onto the table and pushed his chair back, standing up to his full height. He puffed out his chest and demanded to know what this ridiculous interruption was about. He attempted to use his booming corporate voice, ordering the officers to leave his private financial meeting and threatening to call the chief of police, whom he falsely claimed to know personally. I did not let the officers speak. I walked directly to the opposite end of the mahogany table, stopping just inches away from the man who had actively tried to destroy my son. I reached inside my gray suit jacket and pulled out the thick stack of forged loan applications Victor had painstakingly compiled. I raised my hand and let the heavy documents drop onto the polished wood. The papers hit the table with a loud, sharp smack, sliding across the smooth surface until they stopped directly in front of Lance's trembling hands. I spoke in a low, even tone that cut through his arrogant blustering like a razor blade. I told him to look very closely at the signatures on those federal documents. I explained that we knew exactly how he had used a fake marketing interview to harvest my son's identity. I detailed the exact offshore routing numbers he used to hide the stolen funds and feed his collapsing investment scheme. I watched the color drain completely from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His eyes darted wildly from the damning paperwork to Brenda, who was sitting perfectly still in her chair. He looked at his wife, expecting her to jump to his defense, to use her wealth to shield him from the nightmare unfolding before his eyes. Brenda simply looked back at him with absolute freezing contempt. She did not say a single word, but her silent, steady gaze told him everything he needed to know. She was the one who had brought him to the slaughterhouse. The pure, primal instinct of a cornered predator finally kicked in. Lance realized his smooth words and fake titles held absolutely no power in this room. He spun around, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the carpet, and lunged aggressively toward the heavy oak door. He did not make it more than 2 steps. Victor stepped forward, moving with terrifying speed for a man his size. The private investigator planted his feet and caught Lance squarely in the chest, driving him backward with a brutal physical force. Lance stumbled and fell hard against the polished mahogany table, scattering the fake transfer documents across the floor. The 2 uniformed officers moved in instantly, grabbing his arms and forcing them roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the soundproof room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Lance struggled uselessly against the officers, groaning and cursing as they locked his wrists tightly together. One of the officers leaned in close and began reading him his rights in a cold, mechanical voice, listing the multiple charges of identity theft, federal wire fraud, and grand larceny. Lance stopped fighting. His shoulders slumped in total, absolute defeat. The slick corporate titan was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, broken criminal. Brenda sat frozen in her chair, watching the officers drag the man she thought she loved toward the exit. Her hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white with tension. As the heavy door swung open to reveal the empty hallway, a profound shudder ran through her entire body. It was a physical manifestation of absolute horror, mixed with an overwhelming, crushing wave of relief. The parasite that had been quietly bleeding her dry was finally being forcibly removed from her life. The officers marched Lance down the quiet executive corridor, out through the grand marble lobby, and directly into the back of an unmarked police cruiser, waiting in the rain. He was paraded past the very same bank tellers he had planned to defraud, stripped of his expensive facade, and exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. I remained in the quiet conference room with Brenda. We did not speak or celebrate. There was no joy in this victory. It was simply a dirty, painful surgical extraction that had to be done to save our son from a lifetime of ruin. The trap had worked perfectly. The board was completely cleared of the predator. Now we had to deal with the wreckage he left behind and the arrogant boy currently waiting for a miracle in a downtown charity shelter. The walls of the motel room were painted a sickly shade of yellow, peeling at the corners, and stained with years of neglect. Tyler sat on the edge of a sagging mattress that smelled faintly of stale smoke and damp mildew. The $20 bill his father had handed him on the porch, combined with a handful of forgotten silver coins from the bottom of his duffel bag, had barely been enough to secure this miserable room for a single night. Outside the thin, cracked window, the roar of passing trucks on the interstate provided a relentless, mocking soundtrack to his absolute downfall. Tyler clutched his cell phone in his trembling hands. He had managed to plug it into a loose wall outlet, waiting desperately for the battery icon to turn green. In his mind, this was simply a minor setback. It was a temporary misunderstanding that required a quick, sophisticated intervention from a man who knew how to navigate the complex corporate world. He kept his eyes locked on the dark screen, waiting for Lance to call. He imagined his wealthy stepfather pulling up in a sleek black car, walking into this miserable place in a tailored suit, and whisking him away back to the luxury he deserved. He replayed the scenario over and over, using it as a mental shield against the creeping, terrifying realization that he was entirely alone. He ignored the gnawing hunger in his stomach, choosing to believe that a massive, catered dinner was just a phone call away. The cold air seeped through the poorly insulated walls, chilling him to the bone, but his pride refused to let him admit defeat. The phone vibrated violently against his palm. The sudden loud buzz made him jump, nearly dropping the device onto the stained carpet. He fumbled with the screen, swiping hastily to accept the call, without even checking the caller identification. He brought the phone to his ear, ready to hear the smooth, confident voice of his corporate savior, apologizing for the delay. Instead, he heard the ragged, uneven breathing of his mother. Brenda did not offer a comforting greeting. She did not ask if he was warm or safe or if he had found a decent place to sleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely unrecognizable. It was not the polished, melodic tone she used at country club dinners or luxury spas. It was a hollow, scraping whisper of a woman who had just watched her entire world burn to ash. She told him to sit down and listen very carefully. Tyler frowned, his lingering arrogance attempting to push back against the raw panic bleeding through the speaker. He tried to interrupt to complain about the terrible conditions of the motel and demand that Lance transfer emergency funds immediately to a new account. Brenda cut him off with a sharp, agonizing sob that froze the words in his throat. She told him that Lance was gone. Tyler blinked, staring at the peeling yellow wallpaper, trying to process the impossible statement. He asked what she meant, assuming Lance was simply out of town on another brilliant business trip, securing a massive merger. Brenda took a slow, shaky breath and unleashed the devastating truth. She methodically dismantled every single illusion Tyler had clung to for the past 2 years. She explained that the magnificent consulting firm was a complete fabrication, a hollow shell company used to hide stolen money. She revealed that Lance was not a millionaire, but a sophisticated predator running a desperate financial scheme who had secretly drained her entire life savings. Tyler listened in absolute paralyzed horror as his mother explained the true purpose of the prestigious marketing interview Lance had supposedly secured for him. The man he idolized, the titan of industry, who actually got things done, had absolutely no intention of helping Tyler build a career. He had simply used the fake interview as a convenient trap to harvest Tyler's social security number and private banking details. Brenda wept as she explained how Lance weaponized that stolen identity to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent federal loans, intentionally leaving Tyler to face the devastating criminal consequences alone. Tyler felt all the air rush out of his lungs. The dingy motel room began to spin violently. He pressed his free hand against the sagging mattress, trying to anchor himself to reality. He realized with a sickening jolt that he was not a brilliant young executive on the rise. He was a gullible, foolish mark who had willingly handed the keys to his future to a common thief. He opened his mouth to speak, but he could not find a single word. Then Brenda delivered the final crushing revelation. She told him about the elaborate sting operation at the bank that morning. She described the unmarked police vehicles, the armed federal agents, and the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Lance's wrists. Tyler managed to whisper a single question, asking how the police found out, in time to stop the flight. Brenda fell silent for a long, heavy moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the immense weight of profound shame. She told Tyler that it was his father. It was Calvin, the quiet man living in the modest apartment, working the same boring routine, saving pennies like a coward. Calvin was the one who hired the investigators, uncovered the massive fraud, and orchestrated the entire trap to stop Lance from fleeing the country. Brenda confessed that Calvin had forced her to open her eyes and cooperate, saving both of them from absolute permanent ruin. She admitted that while they were busy insulting his lifestyle, Calvin was quietly stepping into a battlefield to shield them from a predator. Tyler lowered the phone slowly, pulling it away from his ear, while his mother continued to cry on the other end of the line. He pressed the red button, disconnecting the call and dropping the device onto the dirty floor. He sat in the profound, deafening silence of the cheap motel room. The monumental weight of his own arrogance crashed down upon his shoulders, shattering him completely. He remembered sitting at the mahogany dining table, looking his father directly in the eye and calling him a loser. He remembered swirling that glass of expensive wine, feeling entirely superior to the man who built the table they were eating on. He had mocked the very man who had spent years secretly subsidizing his luxury apartment, paying his premium car insurance, and acting as his invisible safety net. He had insulted the only person in the world who loved him enough to orchestrate a massive legal sting to save him from federal prison. Tyler bent forward, pressing his face into his trembling hands. The sleek, tailored suits he had carried out of the boutique were discarded in a crumpled heap in the corner of the room, useless and unpaid for. The fancy leather shoes he wore were scuffed and ruined by the mud. The grand fantasy was completely dead, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard truth. He was a 24-year-old man with no job, no money, no home, and no real friends. Every single thing he thought made him special was either a lie told by a con artist or a secret gift provided by the father he despised. The boy who thought he was untouchable finally broke weeping bitterly in the cold, lonely darkness. He realized he had traded genuine unconditional love for a worthless, empty lie. The tears offered no comfort, only the bitter sting of ultimate regret. He sat alone in the miserable yellow room facing the terrifying reality that he had absolutely nothing left to blame but his own blinding arrogance. The foundation of his false reality had been entirely removed, and he was finally hitting the solid, unforgiving ground. The rain had not let up since the afternoon. It continued to fall in heavy cold sheets, turning the city streets into slick, dark mirrors. Tyler walked the 5 miles from the downtown charity shelter back to my apartment complex. He did not have money for bus fare, and his pride had finally been broken enough that he did not even try to beg for a ride. He walked every single grueling step, feeling the cold water soak through his thin jacket and ruin his expensive shoes. He felt the heavy, agonizing weight of his own profound stupidity with every mile he crossed. He walked past the glowing windows of warm restaurants and busy coffee shops, completely invisible to the world he thought he owned just 24 hours ago. It was nearly midnight when I heard the faint, hesitant knock at my front door. It was not the loud, aggressive pounding from the previous evening. It was a soft, cautious sound, the knock of a man who fully expected to be turned away. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final legal documents Victor had sent over. I took a slow, steady breath, pushed the papers aside, and walked toward the entryway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Tyler was standing on the small concrete landing, looking absolutely destroyed. The rain was pouring off the edge of the roof, splashing around his ruined shoes. His designer clothes were plastered to his skin, heavy and dark with freezing water. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard I could hear the sound over the storm. He did not try to push past me. He did not launch into a frantic, chaotic explanation. He did not demand, "Let him inside." He simply stood in the freezing rain, his shoulders slumped in total, absolute defeat. I waited in silence, leaning against the wooden doorframe. I did not offer a warm greeting or a look of pity. I simply watched him, waiting to see if the brutal reality of the last 24 hours had actually managed to penetrate his thick, impenetrable ego. "Dad," he whispered, his voice raw and cracking. "I am so sorry." The words hung in the cold, damp air. He did not follow the apology with an excuse. He did not blame the bank or the weather or his mother. He just stood there, shivering, letting the profound weight of his failure crush him completely. "I was wrong," Tyler continued, forcing the words out through his chattering teeth. "I was so incredibly wrong about everything. I sat at your table and called you a loser. I mocked you for living a quiet life. I thought I was better than you because I wore expensive suits and drove a car I could not even afford. I thought Lance was a genius because he wore a shiny watch and talked loud. I was so completely blind." He paused, taking a ragged, shuddering breath. The rain ran down his face, mixing with the hot, bitter tears he could no longer hold back. "I know about the trust," Tyler said, his voice dropping to a harsh, agonizing whisper. "Mom told me everything. I know you were the one paying for my apartment and my car. I know you were the one covering my credit cards. I thought I was a brilliant young executive, but I was just a spoiled, arrogant child living entirely on your charity. And the moment I thought I had real power, I looked you dead in the eye and insulted you. I listened to my son systematically dismantle his own manufactured identity. It was a brutal, painful process, but it was absolutely necessary. A bone that heals incorrectly must be rebroken before it can ever truly mend. I am terrified," Dad Tyler confessed, his voice trembling with raw, unadulterated fear. "Mom told me about the forged loan applications. She told me about the federal fraud charges Lance set me up for. I do not know what to do. I have absolutely no money. I have no job. I do not even know how to begin fixing the massive nightmare I walked blindly into. I do not expect you to fix it for me. I just needed you to know that I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for treating you like dirt while you were quietly keeping me alive." He finished speaking, and lowered his head, unable to meet my steady gaze. He stood in the freezing downpour, accepting the cold and the misery as his rightful punishment. He expected me to close the door in his face. He expected me to slide the deadbolt shut and leave him to face the federal authorities entirely alone. I did not move. I did not step forward to offer a warm embrace or a comforting word. I did not tell him that everything was going to be all right, because frankly, nothing was all right. He was facing a massive, complicated legal battle that would require years of exhausting, difficult work to unravel. Apologies are cheap, Tyler, I said, my voice low and perfectly even, carrying over the sound of the falling rain. Words are incredibly easy to say when you are standing in the freezing cold, stripped of your false armor. They mean absolutely nothing. Tyler flinched slightly, absorbing the harsh, undeniable truth of my statement. He nodded slowly, accepting the brutal reality that a simple apology could not erase years of arrogance and a mountain of federal wire fraud. Actions are the only currency that holds any actual value in the real world. I continued, my tone completely devoid of anger or sympathy. The man who sat at my dining table and mocked my life is currently dead. That illusion is entirely gone. The only thing that matters now is the man you decide to build from the absolute wreckage of your own terrible decisions. I turned away from the doorframe, leaving it wide open to the freezing night air. I walked into the small hallway closet and pulled out a thick, faded gray towel. I carried it back to the entryway and held it out. Tyler looked at the towel, then up at my face, his eyes wide with profound shock and a tiny, desperate sliver of hope. "I am not going to fix this massive disaster for you, Tyler," I stated firmly, making sure he understood the exact strict boundaries of our new relationship. "I will not pay a single dollar toward your debts. I will not magically erase the legal nightmare Lance created. You are going to face the federal investigators. You are going to get a job. You are going to work every single day to clear your own name and rebuild your life from absolute scratch." I tossed the heavy gray towel. Tyler caught it, awkwardly clutching the rough fabric against his freezing, soaking wet chest. "Dry off," I instructed him, turning my back and walking slowly toward the kitchen. "And wait right there on the porch. We have a massive amount of difficult work to do before the sun comes up." I did not look back. I walked to the kitchen counter and turned on the coffee maker. I poured 2 thick ceramic mugs full of scalding hot black coffee. The grand illusion was completely dead. The invisible safety net was permanently gone. The brutal, exhausting work of building a real life had officially begun. The freezing rain continued to batter the concrete parking lot, creating a loud, steady roar that wrapped around the modest apartment building. I stepped back out onto the small, covered porch, carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs of black coffee and a thick manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. Tyler was sitting on the single plastic lawn chair, hugging the heavy gray towel tightly around his soaking wet shoulders. He was shivering, but the frantic, panicked energy had completely drained out of him, leaving only a hollow, exhausted shell. He looked up when the heavy wooden door opened, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying. I handed him one of the warm mugs. He took it with both trembling hands, letting the intense heat seep into his freezing skin. He took a slow, tentative sip of the bitter liquid and closed his eyes. I pulled up a small wooden stool and sat down directly across from him. I placed the thick manila folder on the small patio table between us, protecting it from the blowing mist. I did not say a word at first. I simply let the harsh reality of the cold night and the scalding coffee settle his racing, chaotic mind. After a long, heavy silence, I tapped the thick paper folder with my index finger and instructed him to open it. Tyler rested his coffee mug on his knee and reached out with a hesitant hand. He flipped open the heavy cover and stared at the top document. It was a comprehensive financial ledger printed directly from my secure private banking portal. His bloodshot eyes scanned the neat columns of numbers and the detailed transaction histories. He frowned in profound, absolute confusion. He recognized the specific routing numbers and the exact monthly payment amounts. They were the precise figures that had covered his luxury high-rise apartment lease, his expensive imported car insurance, and his massive revolving credit card bills. He looked up at me completely bewildered. He asked how I managed to get my hands on the highly confidential internal records of his anonymous family trust. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the truth with absolute freezing clarity. I told him there was never an anonymous family trust. There was never a mysterious corporate benefactor or a wealthy distant relative who recognized his unique, untapped potential. I told him that I was the trust. I was the invisible financial safety net that had been quietly paying for his extravagant, arrogant lifestyle for the past 3 years. Tyler stared at me as if I had suddenly spoken a foreign language. His mind simply could not reconcile the information in front of him with the man sitting across the table. He looked at my faded flannel sweater. He looked over my shoulder at the modest, sparsely decorated living room of my simple apartment. He looked out at the parking lot where my 15-year-old battered pickup truck was parked in the rain. He stammered, asking how a man living on a basic working-class budget could possibly afford to throw thousands of dollars away every single month without going completely bankrupt. I took a slow sip of my coffee and systematically dismantled the final lingering illusion of his entire life. I explained that I was not a poor, struggling man surviving paycheck to paycheck. I revealed that I was a self-made millionaire. I told him about the commercial construction company I had built from absolutely nothing and sold for a massive profit decades ago. I told him about the quiet, incredibly lucrative real estate investments I had secured while he was still a young child. I explained that I chose to live in a basic apartment, drive an old truck, and work a quiet, boring routine because I profoundly valued peace over ostentation. I told him that visible wealth attracts parasites, predators, and endless, complicated problems. I wanted a life of quiet, absolute security, and I had achieved exactly that. The shock on his face was total and complete. The father he had patronized, mocked, and dismissed as an unmotivated loser was actually sitting on a mountain of quiet, impenetrable wealth. He asked me the only logical question remaining. He asked why I had never told him the truth about my money. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I told him I kept my wealth a strict secret because I knew exactly what unearned money does to a young, developing mind. Unearned wealth is a toxic poison. It strips a person of their ambition, their resilience, and their basic human decency. I wanted him to grow up hungry. I wanted him to learn the profound, immense value of hard work, of sweating for a paycheck, and of building a life with his own 2 hands. I wanted to raise a strong, capable man, not a weak, entitled heir who believed the world owed him a luxurious living simply for existing. But I admitted my own terrible failure to him. I told him that my grandparenting plan had completely backfired the moment he dropped out of college. I could not bear the thought of watching him fail so early in his adult life. I panicked. I set up the blind trust, hoping a temporary invisible subsidy would give him the breathing room he needed to find his true calling. Instead, it destroyed him. The invisible money removed all the natural, harsh consequences of his lazy, irresponsible actions. It allowed him to build a towering ego based entirely on a financial foundation he did not earn. It made him the perfect gullible target for a sophisticated corporate predator like Lance. I told him that the dinner party was not the reason I cut off his funding. I did not freeze his bank accounts out of petty, vindictive anger because he insulted my lifestyle. I cut off the money out of absolute life-saving necessity. I realized that my financial protection was actively suffocating his character. The safety net had become a comfortable hammock, trapping him in a permanent state of arrogant childhood. The only way to save his life was to completely burn the safety net to the ground and force him to stand on his own 2 feet. Tyler listened in complete, shattered silence. The overwhelming weight of the truth pressed down on him, crushing the last remaining fragments of his inflated pride. He finally understood that every single thing he thought made him superior was actually purchased by the father he had treated with absolute contempt. I took the manila folder from the table and closed it firmly. I told Tyler that the era of the anonymous family trust was permanently over. I laid out the strict, unbreakable rules for his new reality. I promised him that I would help him navigate the massive, terrifying legal storm Lance had created. I would introduce him to my private investigator and provide access to top-tier defense attorneys to handle the federal identity theft and wire fraud charges. I would ensure he did not go to federal prison for crimes he was too foolish to understand. However, I made one thing absolutely crystal clear. I looked into his tired, bloodshot eyes and swore that I would never give him another single dime of my money. I would not pay his legal retainer. I would not pay off the massive debt Lance had accumulated in his name. I would not buy him a new car or co-sign a lease for a new apartment. I told him he was going to get a minimum wage job immediately. He was going to scrub floors, wash dishes, or dig ditches if necessary. He was going to live in the cheapest room he could find, and he was going to surrender every extra penny he earned to clear his own fraudulent debts. He was going to endure the long, humiliating, exhausting process of rebuilding his ruined credit score and clearing his name entirely from scratch. It was going to take years of grueling, painful work, and he was going to do it completely on his own. Tyler did not argue. He did not beg for a softer punishment or a small temporary loan to ease the harsh transition. The arrogant boy who demanded luxury was gone. The exhausted, broken man sitting on my porch simply looked down at his ruined leather shoes and nodded his head. He took a long, slow drink of his black coffee, accepting the bitter taste of his new reality. He told me he understood the terms perfectly. The long, difficult road to redemption was stretching out before him, but for the first time in his entire life, he was finally walking on solid, honest ground. 6 heavy months evaporated into the cold winter air. The passing of time was no longer measured by extravagant weekend getaways or expensive dinners, but by the brutal, relentless ticking of a punch clock. Tyler woke up every single morning at 5 o'clock, in a room so small he could touch both walls if he stretched out his arms. His new home was a cramped, damp studio apartment, located above a noisy auto repair shop on the very edge of the city limits. The luxurious skyline views he once took for granted were replaced by a single smudged window overlooking a brick alleyway filled with dumpsters. There was no marble counter, no stainless steel appliances, and no concierge to greet him. There was only a stained sink, a rattling refrigerator, and a sagging mattress resting directly on the scuffed linoleum floor. Yet for the very first time in his adult life, Tyler actually owned the space he inhabited. Every single cent of the meager rent was paid for by the sweat off his own back. The young man who used to spend thousands of dollars on custom-tailored silk suits now wore a faded, stiff cotton uniform. His mornings began at the local hardware store, where he worked the early loading shift. He spent hours hauling heavy bags of concrete, mixing cement, and stacking raw lumber in the freezing open-air yard. The soft, unblemished hands of the fake corporate executive were completely gone, replaced by rough, calloused skin covered in deep blisters. Customers would often walk right past him, treating him with the exact same dismissive arrogance he used to aim at working-class people just half a year ago. They would snap their fingers, demand immediate service, and complain loudly when he was not fast enough. Tyler did not argue back or demand respect. He simply lowered his head, offered a polite apology, and carried the heavy loads to their vehicles with a quiet, unshakable dignity. When his shift at the hardware store ended, his grueling day was only half over. Tyler would take a crowded public bus across town to a busy roadside diner to begin his second job. He spent his evenings standing over a massive steaming industrial sink, scrubbing burnt grease off heavy iron skillets and scraping food off hundreds of ceramic plates. The heat in the kitchen was suffocating, and the smell of old frying oil permanently soaked into his hair and clothes. His back ached with a deep, relentless, throbbing pain that never truly went away. He worked until midnight, mopping the sticky tile floors and dragging heavy bags of garbage out to the dark alley. The illusion of his glamorous life had been entirely scrubbed away, leaving behind only the pure, exhausting reality of honest survival. The physical exhaustion was only one part of his heavy burden. The legal nightmare created by Lance was still casting a massive dark shadow over his every waking moment. The federal investigation into the identity theft and wire fraud was an ongoing complicated beast. Tyler spent his only day off every week sitting in sterile government offices cooperating fully and completely with the Financial Crimes Division. He handed over every document, every email, and every message he had ever received from his former stepfather. He sat across from federal agents and openly admitted his own profound stupidity, taking absolute full responsibility for blindly handing over his personal information to a predator. Every spare dollar he earned from the hardware store and the diner went straight toward paying down the massive legal restitution. He lived on generic rice and canned beans, counting every single penny with desperate precision. His mother was fighting her own difficult battle for survival across town. Brenda had completely lost her sprawling suburban estate to the bank foreclosures. The grand illusion she had sacrificed our marriage to achieve had vanished, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a mountain of toxic debt. She had moved into a small, dark, one-bedroom condo in a neighborhood she used to mock. She was forced to take a job as a receptionist at a local dental clinic, working long, tedious hours just to slowly rebuild her entirely depleted retirement savings. Brenda and Tyler rarely spoke about the past. The shame was simply too deep and too painful to navigate. They shared a quiet, mutual understanding of the catastrophic mistakes they had made, stripped of their false pride and focusing entirely on the basic simple mechanics of keeping their heads above water. I watched this entire painful transformation unfold from a very strict, careful distance. I did not intervene. I did not offer a single word of unearned comfort, and I certainly did not offer a single dollar of financial relief. I maintained an absolute impenetrable boundary. I would occasionally park my battered old pickup truck across the street from the busy diner late at night. I would sit in the dark cabin drinking hot coffee from a thermos and watch the back alleyway. I would see the heavy metal door swing open and watch my son step out into the freezing night air, dragging massive leaking bags of refuse. I would watch him heave the garbage into the dumpsters, wipe the sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirty sleeve, and lean against the brick wall for just a moment of exhausted rest. My heart would ache watching him suffer through the grueling physical labor. A father naturally wants to run forward, sweep away the pain, and hand his child a comfortable, easy life. But I knew that acting on that instinct would be the absolute worst thing I could ever do. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to stay in the dark truck. I had to let him feel the burning ache in his muscles. I had to let him feel the sharp sting of hunger and the heavy, suffocating pressure of his own debt. I was no longer the invisible safety net shielding him from reality. I was the silent witness to his necessary suffering. Yet as the long, difficult months dragged on, I began to see a profound, beautiful shift in my son. The arrogant sneer that used to permanently rest on his face was entirely erased. The frantic, desperate energy of a boy trying to pretend he was a king had vanished completely. In its place, a new solid foundation was slowly forming. When Tyler carried the heavy garbage bags, he did not look broken. He looked grounded. When he stood in the alleyway catching his breath, his eyes were clear and focused. He was no longer looking for a magical shortcut or a rich savior to rescue him from his problems. He was carrying the full, immense weight of his own life directly on his own shoulders. He walked back to the bus stop every night with a slow, steady, purposeful stride. His uniform was stained and his boots were falling apart, but he carried himself with an incredible, quiet dignity that no amount of expensive custom tailoring could ever buy. He was finally earning his own respect penny by painful penny. The toxic poison of unearned wealth and arrogant entitlement was sweating out of his system drop by drop. The boy I had protected had died the night he was locked out in the cold rain. The exhausted, humbled young man walking through the dark city streets was completely different. He was finally becoming real. He was becoming a man who understood the profound, undeniable value of hard, honest work. I would start my old truck, shift it quietly into gear, and drive back to my warm apartment, knowing that the brutal, painful process of rebuilding was working exactly as it needed to. The harsh winter eventually thawed into a muddy, unforgiving spring. Tyler returned to his tiny studio apartment after a grueling 14-hour shift. His muscles burned with a familiar dull ache, and his hands were stained with grease and dark dirt. He stopped at the rusted metal mailboxes lining the busy entrance of his building. He turned a small brass key and pulled open the dented door. Inside sat a single crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. It was not a junk mail flyer or a past-due utility bill. It was the final legal settlement regarding the massive wire fraud his former stepfather had committed using his stolen identity. Tyler carried the heavy envelope up the creaking wooden stairs to his room. He did not turn on the television or take off his heavy work boots. He sat directly on the edge of his sagging mattress and tore the paper open with calloused fingers. The typed letter outlined the absolute final terms required to clear his name permanently and avoid any lingering federal prosecution. The government had seized what they could from the offshore accounts, but a massive discrepancy remained. Tyler read the bold printed numbers at the bottom of the page. It was a formal demand for restitution. He owed a staggering amount of money to completely close the case and buy back his freedom. Tyler reached into his pocket and pulled out his cheap prepaid cell phone. He opened his basic banking application and stared at the green numbers on the glowing screen. Over the past 6 months, he had lived like an absolute monk. He had survived on generic oatmeal and tap water. He had not bought a single new piece of clothing or spent a penny on entertainment. Every spare dollar from the hardware store and the diner had been ruthlessly saved and locked away. He had accumulated a small, hard-earned fortune built entirely on his own sweat and physical pain. But as he compared his total savings to the massive number printed on the federal settlement letter, a cold, heavy dread settled deep into his stomach. He was still several $1,000s short. The deadline for the payment was rapidly approaching. If he missed the transfer date, the settlement offer would be permanently revoked, and the federal indictment process would automatically resume. Tyler dropped the legal document onto the scuffed linoleum floor. The sheer magnitude of the gap felt entirely impossible to bridge on a minimum wage salary. He was already working his body to the absolute breaking point. There simply were not enough hours left in the week to scrub more dishes or haul more concrete. He sat in the quiet, dim room listening to the rain begin to tap against his single dirty window. Tyler looked down at his phone. He opened his contact list and scrolled slowly down until his thumb rested directly over my name. He stared at the bright white letters glowing in the darkness. The temptation hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He knew exactly what was sitting on the other side of that phone call. He knew his father was a self-made millionaire with a massive hidden fortune locked away in secure trust accounts. He knew that the amount of money he desperately needed to stay out of federal prison was practically pocket change to a man with my resources. One simple phone call could instantly erase the terrifying nightmare. He could dial the number, swallow his pride, and beg for a temporary loan. He could promise to pay it back with interest. He could leverage our shared blood and my paternal instinct to secure a quick, easy rescue. His thumb hovered just a fraction of an inch above the green call button. The easy way out was waiting right there, promising immediate relief from the crushing anxiety and the bone-deep physical exhaustion. His mind began to flood with brilliant rationalizations. He told himself it would just be a formal business loan. He could draft a legal contract and agree to a strict repayment schedule with heavy interest. He tried to convince himself that reaching out to family for temporary financial assistance was a normal, acceptable thing for a young man to do in a severe crisis. He closed his eyes and imagined how incredibly simple it would be to just let the invisible safety net catch him one last time. He could end the endless double shifts and sleep for a full 8 hours without waking up in a cold sweat over federal deadlines. Tyler kept his eyes closed and took a long, slow breath. He remembered the freezing night he stood on my porch, stripped of his arrogant illusions. He remembered the feeling of absolute worthlessness that comes from building a life entirely on someone else's money. He realized that calling me now would completely destroy every single ounce of honest respect he had spent the last 6 months agonizingly building. If he took my money to solve this problem, he would forever remain a child waiting to be rescued. Tyler opened his eyes and looked at the phone. He pressed the power button, shutting the screen off completely. He tossed the device onto the bed and stood up. He did not surrender to the panic, and he did not choose the easy way out. The next morning, Tyler walked into the hardware store 2 hours before his scheduled shift. He marched directly into the manager's cramped office and asked to take on the worst, most undesirable maintenance duties available. He begged for the early opening shifts and the late closing routines. He then walked 3 miles down the road to a local commercial landscaping company. He stood in front of the owner and offered to work every single weekend, doing the grueling, back-breaking labor of digging irrigation trenches and hauling heavy stones. The owner looked at his thin frame and warned him the work was completely brutal, but Tyler did not waver. Tyler took on a third job, sacrificing his only remaining hours of sleep. He spent his Saturdays and Sundays knee-deep in thick, freezing mud, swinging a heavy steel pickaxe until his hands bled inside his cheap work gloves. His muscles screamed in constant agony, and his lungs burned with the cold air, but he did not quit. He hauled massive landscaping boulders across sprawling yards, pushing his body far past its natural limits. Every time he felt like collapsing, he thought about the settlement letter and kept digging. He chose to destroy his own physical comfort rather than sacrifice his newly forged character. The pain became a profound badge of honor, proving he was finally paying his own way through the world. Miles away in my quiet apartment, I sat at my wooden desk and opened a secure, encrypted email. The message was a routine weekly update from Victor, my private investigator. I had instructed Victor to discreetly monitor the federal settlement process to ensure Tyler was not unfairly crushed by the legal system. Victor provided a detailed report of the final restitution demand and the exact balance of my son's bank accounts. Victor noted the significant financial shortfall and warned me that Tyler was running out of time. But as I read the final paragraph of the detailed report, a profound, overwhelming warmth spread through my entire chest. Victor had documented my son's recent actions. He reported the early morning meeting at the hardware store and the new weekend employment at the commercial landscaping company. Victor observed Tyler digging ditches in the freezing mud, determined to earn the remaining money completely on his own. I leaned back in my wooden chair and read the report a second time. I did not feel pity for his physical pain or worry about his exhaustion. I felt a massive, undeniable surge of absolute pride. I closed the laptop and smiled softly into the quiet room. The arrogant, entitled boy was officially gone forever. In his place, a strong, independent man was finally standing tall. The harsh, painful lesson had truly taken root, and the foundation of his new life was entirely unbreakable. Exactly 1 year had passed since the night the grand illusion was shattered in my dining room. I was sitting at the exact same mahogany table, running my bare hand over the smooth, polished wood. The apartment was entirely quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the old wall clock. The changing of the seasons had brought a crisp autumn breeze through the slightly open window, carrying the scent of dry leaves and cooling asphalt. I did not have my laptop open. I was not checking secure banking portals or monitoring offshore trust accounts. Those invisible financial tethers had been permanently severed, and the heavy burden of secret protection was entirely gone. I was simply enjoying a quiet morning, drinking plain black coffee and sketching out a design for a new wooden cabinet I intended to build. The quiet peace of the morning was a hard-earned luxury. The sudden sharp sound of the doorbell broke the deep silence of the apartment. I placed my pencil down on the drafting paper and walked slowly toward the entryway. I did not look through the small glass peephole before unlocking the deadbolt. I pulled the heavy wooden door open and found my son standing on the small concrete landing. The physical transformation standing before me was absolutely staggering. Tyler was completely unrecognizable from the soft, arrogant boy who had worn custom-tailored silk suits and expensive cologne. The young man on my porch wore heavy faded denim work pants and a thick canvas jacket stained with dried mud and grass sap. His hands gripping the metal railing were rough, heavily calloused, and permanently scarred from months of brutal physical labor. He looked incredibly exhausted, carrying the deep, permanent fatigue that only comes from waking up before dawn to engage in relentless manual work. Yet beneath the dirt and the obvious exhaustion, his face radiated a profound, undeniable sense of genuine happiness. His eyes were perfectly clear, steady, and completely devoid of the frantic, desperate entitlement that used to poison his every interaction. Tyler did not shuffle his feet or look away nervously. He stood tall and met my gaze directly. He reached into the deep front pocket of his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a plain white paper envelope. The edges were slightly crumpled from being carried around all morning, but he handled it with the utmost care, as if it were the most valuable object in the world. He extended his rough hand and offered the envelope to me. He did not launch into a long, dramatic speech. He did not demand praise or launch into a theatrical apology. He simply stated in a calm, quiet voice that the document inside was the official final payment receipt from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. He had transferred the last remaining dollar of his mandated restitution early that morning. The massive fraudulent debt created by his former stepfather was entirely erased. He had successfully cleared his name from the federal indictment process completely on his own. He worked the grueling early morning shifts at the hardware store, the late night shifts washing dishes at the diner, and the brutal weekend hours digging irrigation trenches in the freezing mud. He sacrificed his comfort, his sleep, and his pride to pay back every single stolen penny. Tyler told me he did not come here to ask for a reward or to request a loan to celebrate. He just wanted his father to know that the absolute hardest task of his life was officially complete. I looked down at the plain white envelope resting in my palm, and then back up at the strong, capable man standing on my porch. I did not offer a grand emotional declaration. I simply stepped backward, opening the heavy wooden door wide enough for him to enter. I told him the coffee was still hot and invited him to come inside. Tyler wiped his muddy work boots carefully on the welcome mat, taking extra care not to track any dirt onto the clean floors of my apartment. He walked into the dining room and approached the large mahogany table. This was the exact same piece of furniture where he had previously sat, swirling an expensive glass of wine and loudly calling me a loser. He did not hesitate or shrink away from the memory. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat down, resting his calloused hands on the polished surface with a deep, respectful appreciation for the craftsmanship. I walked into the kitchen and retrieved a second thick ceramic mug. I poured the steaming black coffee, filling it to the very brim, and carried it back to the dining room. I placed the warm mug directly in front of him and took my own seat across the table. We sat in the quiet apartment, drinking the bitter, dark liquid in a comfortable, easy silence. We did not discuss the spectacular downfall of his mother or the long prison sentence awaiting his former stepfather. We did not talk about phantom corporate marketing jobs, luxury high-rise apartments, or invisible family trust funds. Those toxic, empty illusions belonged to a completely different lifetime. Instead, Tyler talked to me about his landscaping job. He explained the complex, difficult process of installing an intricate stone retaining wall for a commercial client on the west side of the city. He talked about the physical challenges of grading the soil and selecting the proper materials to ensure the heavy structure would withstand the harsh winter rains. His voice carried the passionate, genuine enthusiasm of a man who was deeply proud of the tangible, permanent work he was creating with his own two hands. I listened carefully and then shared my own thoughts. I told him about the new woodworking project I was designing. I explained the specific joinery techniques I planned to use to ensure the wooden cabinet would last for generations without relying on cheap metal fasteners. As I watched him describe the blisteringly hard work of moving stones weighing hundreds of pounds, I noticed the subtle changes in his posture. He sat straight with his shoulders squared, carrying an undeniable physical strength that had replaced his former slouching arrogance. He spoke about his coworkers at the landscaping company, treating them not as invisible servants, but as trusted brothers in arms who shared the heavy burden of manual labor. He told me how the crew chief, a strict, unforgiving man, had initially doubted his ability to survive a single weekend shift. Tyler explained with a quiet, humble pride how he had eventually earned that man's respect by refusing to quit when his hands bled and his muscles failed. The stories he shared were not designed to impress me with status or wealth. They were honest, raw reflections of a man learning how to navigate the absolute bottom of the working world with integrity and grace. He had learned that true authority does not come from a platinum credit card or a fake corporate title. True authority is forged in the grueling fires of absolute responsibility. Tyler leaned forward, asking detailed questions about the grain of the wood and the specific tools required for the precise cuts. We spent the next hour engaged in a deep, meaningful conversation about honest labor and the quiet satisfaction of building something real. There were no hidden agendas or subtle power plays between us. The heavy, suffocating burden of secret financial subsidies was entirely gone. The toxic poison of unearned wealth had been completely sweated out of his system, leaving behind a remarkably solid, grounded human being. I looked across the table and realized that destroying his false reality was the most painful, difficult decision I had ever made in my entire life. But sitting here drinking coffee with a son who finally understood the profound value of his own sweat, I knew it was absolutely the right choice. The arrogant, entitled boy had been permanently evicted from the world. The man who sat across from me had earned his place at the table through brutal, relentless perseverance. The relationship between us was forever changed, no longer built on a fragile foundation of hidden money and desperate illusions. It was now built on the unbreakable bedrock of mutual respect and hard-earned reality. The profound lesson embedded in this story is the dangerous difference between providing a safety net and building a hammock. True parental love does not mean shielding a child from every hardship or artificially funding a lifestyle they have not earned. Unearned wealth breeds toxic entitlement and leaves a person completely vulnerable to sophisticated predators. By burning down the false sanctuary, Calvin gave his son the ultimate gift of harsh reality. Hitting rock bottom forces us to discover our genuine strength. Respect, dignity, and true independence cannot be inherited or purchased. They must be meticulously forged through the grueling fires of absolute personal accountability. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences with setting difficult boundaries in the comment section below.